So this is the second webinar in our series for Customer Centricity Month 2022. Before I hand over to today's speakers, Stu and Andrés, and while people are still tuning in, I just wanted to say hello and introduce myself and what Customer Centricity Month is. So I'm Lauren and I head up events and marketing at CX Partners. And at CX Partners, we work with organisations to drive growth, to unlock opportunities and to get teams working really effectively together. And we do this through detailed research programmes, through user-centred design, and of course through embedding a culture of customer centricity within organisations. So earlier this year, we launched our customer centricity model, which was the culmination of a studied and detailed research piece with over 100 European brands into what builds a highly resilient and successful organisation. And our study found that organisations with higher customer centricity maturity saw 9 times higher revenue, they saw 90% higher employee satisfaction, and they were they found it much easier to have higher agility to make changes happen, which, as we know, is so important in the current climate and reflecting back over the past 2 years. Our customer centricity model and the 5 dimensions that it consists of were created so that organisations can easily assess the state of their customer centricity internally and also find out where there's room for improvement. So if you haven't already, I'd really recommend you take our self-assessment, which will give you your customer centricity score and recommendations for how you can improve. And we'll share that link in the chat. Last week's webinar, as part of Customer Centricity Month, focused on process. And we heard from Steve, who's one of the CX Partners team, and Paul from the British Council. And if you missed that session, don't worry, we've got it here and you can see that link in the chat as well, and you can catch up on it another time. So as I say, this is the second webinar and we've got 2 further sessions this month and they're all on Wednesdays throughout November. So let us know if you don't have the rest of them in your diary. So I'm now going to hand over to today's brilliant speakers. So Stu is another member of the CX Partners team who's going to be leading today's session, and then he'll hand over to our brilliant guest speaker, Andrés, who's the VP of Design at Visa Europe. There'll be time at the end for questions, but please add them into the Q&A or the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll run through as many as we can at the end. So Stu, I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm Stu Tayler. I'm the practice director at CX Partners, and today I'm going to be talking about governance. More specifically, I'm going to talk about how you can empower teams without losing control and creating chaos. But governance can be a bit abstract. So before we get into that, I'm going to talk about what do we mean by governance. So according to the Chartered Governance Institute for UK and Ireland, corporate governance is the system of rules, practices and processes by which a company is directed and controlled. But I think it's probably easier to understand what governance is when you see it isn't working. So I'm going to describe a situation which may or may not be familiar, but it's something we see from time to time in our consulting work. So we hear leaders complain that maybe design teams aren't doing anything innovative. Maybe the output isn't any good and it's not producing the right business results. But then when you speak to delivery teams and design teams, you hear that people at the top they don't really get it. They don't get design and nobody's really happy. And then when you look a bit deeper at the problem, you see the following things happening. People at the top, they may have good intentions about being customer centric, but somewhere down the kind of chain of management, people start to prescribe fixed solutions, and then you add in fixed deadlines and fixed budgets, and normally that's to give the impression of certainty because it helps unlock budget, but it means that delivery teams end up being really just focused on implementing features. And in those scenarios, delivery teams get overwhelmed by a kind of never-ending backlog of feature requests, and it means quality drops as people are more squeezed, and then leaders are drawn into discussions, and they end up focusing on what's being delivered, and they can start making design decisions. And that means delivery teams and designers get demoralized. You know, there's no chance to be creative. They're just fulfilling someone else's orders. Hopefully that kind of illustrates what happens when governance can go wrong. So what's the answer to the situation? And we think it's to decentralize control. So in March, we wrote a white paper on customer centricity, and this was one of our 5 keys to being customer centric. And by decentralizing control, we mean kind of empowering teams and giving them control to make decisions about the products that they're delivering. In that paper, we found that organizations who were performing higher in terms of customer centricity were more likely to give delivery teams the autonomy to make decisions. And the reason that leads to customer centricity is that the decisions are made by people who are closer to customers. And because you're grounding decisions in user insights, it means that decisions are often of better quality. One of the top scorers in our 2021 customer centricity survey was Octopus Energy. And this idea of decentralizing control was seen as key to their success. They told us that we talk a lot about freedom and responsibility, to let them go and have conversations and come up with good solutions. Okay, so from the delivery team's point of view, this sounds great, you know, decentralized control, you know, they get creative freedom. But from the management point of view, it can be unsettling and may even be counterintuitive. You know, to improve governance, you've somehow got to give it up. And if you're giving up control, how do you stop it descending into chaos? And can you really trust the teams to make the right decisions? So this is probably the kind of important challenge for leaders. How do you empower teams without creating chaos? And I think essentially you need to balance autonomy with alignment. And there's a range of ways to do that, but I'm going to talk about 5 key ones that we've found work at CX Partners. So they are mission, vision, outcomes focus, service design, and process. Okay, so first up is mission. And I'm going to begin by just looking at a couple of statements from well-known companies. So this is a really well-known one from Google, and their mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And Airbnb's is to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere. So these missions focus on why the organization exists, and you know, they're there to inspire people, and through doing that, it can create alignment. And then coming back to Octopus Energy again, when we spoke to them, they cited mission as being really key to being customer focused. So they said a lot of it comes back to having a real singularity of mission. We're quite a big group now, over 2,000 staff around the world doing lots of different things, from energy, retail to design, and so on. But they're all aligned around a mission to drive cheaper, greener energy. And maybe this next point is kind of counterintuitive for a talk on customer centricity, but I think this mission should really come from leadership and something they believe in. But if you look at these missions that we've gone through, they're all based around people. So universally accessible information, a world where anyone can belong, cheaper, greener energy. And one last example from one of our clients, Hargreaves Lansdowne. Their mission is to empower people to save and invest with confidence. So again, you can see how it's focused on people, and then the work we do with them purposefully aligns around that mission. Okay, next up is vision. And a vision really just takes the mission and makes it more specific. And as many of you probably know, the useful thing about visions is that they can look years into the future and allow you to be more ambitious. So I'm going to play this video now. It's just a clip from a vision video we made for Hargreaves Lansdowne. Hopefully the sound will be okay.
It all starts with the client. We want to be the UK's most client-obsessed company, making our services personal to them. Everyone is different, so we'll learn about each person's goals and priorities, from experts to novices. Our propositions will give each person the support that suits them best. Then we'll personalize their experience, tailoring what clients are shown to what they need at that point. When choices are complex or overwhelming, we'll help narrow down the options and make the right decision for them.
Okay, so I think something to note about that video is that we don't show any detailed interfaces. And I think that's the key thing about visions, is that they aren't a specification. Just as this quote says, you need to be stubborn on vision, but not on details. Instead, what visions are meant to do is provide context and direction for autonomous teams. If they dictate a particular solution, it would disempower them. Another organization that we spoke to for our customer centricity report was BlaBlaCar, and they're a carpooling service. When we spoke to them, they were saying their exec had strong alignment around what they were aiming to do, but the rest of the company wasn't quite there. And so they set about creating a vision to explain where they were going. And to do that, they used photos and videos to tell the story of 3 particular users of a future service. And they didn't focus on features when they're doing that. They focused on the story that they wanted to enable for those people. And they presented that at like a big all hands meeting. Apparently they received really amazing feedback, and it's still referred to today. So it's kind of keeping that alignment through the organization. Visions don't necessarily need to be in a video format. They can be a prototype, or as in this case, a storyboard. So this is a vision we created for an energy company. And again, storyboards like this allow us to describe the experience we want to move towards, but not the detailed features. So it allows us, again, to be vague about those details. Another key thing about those examples is that they're all based around user research. And that's something we really try and focus on at Six Partners, is using customer insight to inform the strategy, rather than it just being used for delivery purposes. Okay, the third thing is a focus on outcomes. I think people are probably fairly familiar with the idea of focusing on outcomes. So the value that customers receive rather than outputs, so the number of features that you deliver. But even though it's probably fairly familiar, I think it's an important way to balance autonomy with alignment. And again, most people are probably fairly familiar with OKRs. There seem to be a key way to enable outcomes, a focus on outcomes. And the idea being that if you think about the objectives and the key results, you don't end up focusing so much on what you're actually delivering. But we've seen OKRs misused in the past. Objectives can be quite high level and vague, and so can key results. And that means they can kind of be twisted to suit the things that people are already doing. So you don't have this real shift to thinking about outcomes. But I think we can improve how we think about OKRs. So Josh Seiden, who he literally wrote the book on outcomes over outputs, he describes outcomes as a change in human behavior that drives business results. And that's a really useful clarification there, that we're not talking about the business results themselves, we're talking about the behavior that leads to those results. So as an example, we're talking about reducing support calls rather than the cost reduction that leads to. And he's got a useful tip in terms of thinking about OKRs, and that's to think about the key results part as outcomes, or in his terms, measurable customer behavior. So that might be 1,000 new user registrations in the first week, or 25% of new users converting to being repeat users. It ends up making them less vague and helps keep people honest. And that's an approach we took when we helped implement a system of OKRs for an energy company a few years ago. Through our organization research, we found that design decisions were being made at a board level, and no one close to delivery was really empowered to make decisions. So we knew there was this need to increase autonomy, and we identified OKRs as being one of the ways to do that. So we began by defining strategic outcomes at the kind of top vision level. And then we broke those down into different value streams. And again, we defined objectives. And then for each objective, we defined a set of key results, but did that in terms of the changes to customer behavior that we were wanting. So it's things like reducing requests for duplicate invoices. And this helped the organization shift to monitoring outcomes rather than, the board making design decisions, which is what was happening before. But the other interesting thing about this shift was that it improved decision making as well. So people were thinking about how does a particular decision affect the outcome that they're trying to achieve rather than how does it affect the deadline. Okay, fourth is service design. And we see quite often organizations, they might have established multidisciplinary product teams and they're working in lean agile ways. They may even be outcomes focused and have an OKR system in place, but they can still suffer from alignment issues. So I'll give you an example. A common problem is that different teams within the same organization may be working on the same problem or the same part of a journey without the other being aware of it. A few years ago, we were doing some work for a building society, and our team were looking at propositions around people approaching retirement and thinking about their pensions. And we'd identified this opportunity where we were going to focus on getting people to transfer their pensions into what we call a consolidated pot. However, there was another team already looking at transferring ISAs, which from a user experience point of view is very closely related. So we could have ended up both working on the same thing and wasting effort and time. But luckily, though, we were applying service design principles, so we were trying to work beyond silos across multiple product teams, and we quickly identified that duplication. And so it allowed us to shift our focus onto other opportunities. So it's a more efficient way of working. And I think this is where service design can really help by orchestrating the efforts of different product teams into a coherent whole service. One of the ways they can do that is through mapping and helping product teams to make sense of that wider service. So on a recent project, we found that simply visualizing journeys that cross multiple products can help teams to understand how their part of the puzzle relates to others. And it creates a bit of a, aha moment. And it helps, firstly, it helps to identify where there's duplicate effort, but it can also help to identify gaps. So you might find there's a need that isn't being served by a particular product team. That project's also a useful reminder that maps are really just the start in this type of work. A key part of that service design role is to work with the different teams. So you can highlight issues, but then you need to work together to resolve them. If service design was to try and dictate solutions, again, that just disempowers the teams. Okay, finally, we've got process, and I'll be fairly brief on this because our previous webinar was all about process. But we think a clear process framework, something like GDS's Discovery Alpha Beta, can help teams to retain autonomy. And that's firstly because it helps set the expectations of stakeholders that are involved. So in a discovery phase, teams are usually focused on learning about users and what their needs are, rather than delivering solutions. And so if stakeholders are clear about that, they'll understand not to kind of expect changes to business results or any delivery output. Secondly, the other reason it helps autonomy is that it helps to establish trust. So if leaders are confident that teams are following best practice and the right process, they'll be reassured. And it means they can focus their efforts on understanding where teams are in that process rather than getting involved in design decisions. We've been working with an organization to help them shape an approach to their continuous delivery. And to do that, we piloted ways of working, and we created a process framework, and we documented that in an online playbook, which you can see here. And that then helps subsequent projects to run more smoothly in less time and so on. But a really important thing about this is that it was bespoke to the organization. So it was written after the pilot, and we iterated upon it after subsequent projects. And it's what worked for this organization. And it brings me on to a bit of a warning that we shouldn't become too dogmatic about process. We shouldn't let it undermine the focus on outcomes. Best practice evolves. We learn what does and doesn't work for a particular organization, and we need to integrate ideas from other disciplines. And so we really need to allow process to be flexible. So just to summarize, if you want to decentralize control, you need to balance the need for autonomy with alignment. And to do that, we recommend having a clear mission and purpose that's focused on people. Secondly, having an inspiring vision that's driven by customer insights and that doesn't specify details. Thirdly, by focusing on outcomes and using tools like OKRs that help monitor changes to customer behavior. Fourth, through using service design to coordinate different product team efforts. And finally, a clear process to set expectations and establish trust while not being too dogmatic. Then if you can create aligned autonomous teams, hopefully you should be able to unlock the value of customer centricity. So Laura mentioned this at the beginning, but I'll just quickly recap on what that value of customer centricity is. So in our research, this is some of the key points we discovered that customer-centric organizations have higher revenue growth, they're faster and more nimble, so changes take weeks or months rather than years. And finally, we found that there was higher levels of staff engagement where customer centricity had been adopted. Okay, thanks very much for listening to me today. I'm going to hand over to Andrés now, who's going to talk more about governance at Visa. Hi, Andrés.
Hello there.
Hey.
Thank you very much. If you can flip onto the slides, please.
Yeah.
There we go. If we can go to the next one. Perfect. Hello, everybody. Or hola, as I like to say. I'm Andrés López. I head up design for Visa in Europe. It's a pan-European operation, and we're one of 5 regions in the world. Next slide, please. So in Visa design, which I'm pretty much going to touch quickly now, we're kind of split into kind of some functions. We're more on the reactive side, where we help the business win more business. We're on the product side, where we help new product development. And then we're on the understanding side, where we do a ton of research to kind of show us the way in all of these. Without much further ado, let's go to the next slide, please. So when the fine folks at CX Partners kindly invited me to talk today and talk about governance, it got me thinking. And I was like, well, what could we talk about? And especially after the really good presentation we've just seen, what can I add to that? So basically, I'm going to talk about 2 things. I'm going to talk about process, and I'm going to talk about people, which at the end of the day, for me, is the core of what governance is. So if we go to the next slide, please. If we jump to the next one. So if we talk about process is king. It's been at the fore for the last few years. It's everything and pretty much anything to everybody. But I always say, don't believe the hype. We need to be very careful. And I think Stuart mentioned this in his presentation a moment ago. It's very easy to fall in love and be very religious to a process, but we have to be very careful. And there's a really interesting quote. If we go to the next slide, please. And there's a quote by Professor Feynman, and it was also a quote that was used by the Joker in The Dark Knight, which is, be careful when you blindly follow the masses. Sometimes the M is silent. I think you can all do the math there if you remove the M. So basically, it's just be very, very careful as we go forward. Next slide, please. But also, a perfect process is what we see out there. We see the success, in other companies, and we think, oh, that perfect process is going to work for us, but it's not the case. A perfect process isn't going to be embraced by an imperfect organization, and all organizations are imperfect. Visa, all of them, we all have our intricacies and our own little problems. So adapting something which was probably made specifically for someone else does bring some problems. And I'll give you an example. If we can go to the next slide, please. When I came to Visa 3 years ago, we were basically working, let's say the BAU in design process. We were framing the problem or trying to get to that problem statement, and then we were framing the solution. And this kind of worked, it worked well. But Visa is a company that the environment affects how we play. So if we go to the next slide, please. What we started factoring in first, we were framing the environment and, framing not just who were the actors, what was the, the economic state or the economic market out there. And then we better frame a problem and then better frame a solution. I'll give you an example. We've been working extremely hard on all things sustainability. And up until a while back, you had your carbon calculators, you could go in, you could, understand your carbon footprint. We would educate the customers or the consumers to, hey, you can offset this and there's a series of actions you can do. And this worked fine. And it was a wonderful experience. But the problem is now the market's changed. If you look about the markets now, interest rates are going up. We're pretty much looking into a recession. It's tighter. People are not going to offset anymore. People are probably going to keep those 100, 200 pounds or whatever they were offsetting, and they're going to keep it to pay electricity bills. They're going to keep it to pay other things. So all of a sudden, the environment has shifted the problem. All of a sudden, it's not about informing and helping them offset. That problem doesn't work anymore. So all of a sudden, we're kind of understanding that for us, it works for framing the environment, framing the problem, and framing the solution. And one thing I want to be very clear, that works for us. We're not pitching this as everyone should be doing it. This in particular is what it works for Visa. If we go to the next slide, please. So basically, there's a really fantastic comment by a friend at Pentagram, Natasha Jen. Don't trust any process. Doesn't promise any outcome. Basically, you've got to be hungry for results. So again, it goes back to that notion we mentioned at the beginning. Don't be too religious about it. If we go to the next slide, please. So if we break down something we've done here and something which is work in progress, here I've just highlighted a very high level design process where there's a discovery phase, there's a design phase, and there's a development phase. I think it doesn't matter which process you use, it kind of falls in line with this. So what we did, to understand and help it work for us and kind of map out what we do, we deconstructed this. So we looked at discover, we looked at design, we looked at develop, and we said, okay, what's in our toolbox? What are the activities? What are the deliverables? And who are the people we have that can deliver upon these? If we go to the next slide, please. So we kind of broke them down. So all of a sudden, discover was a slew of services. It could be qual research, quant, it could be jobs to be done. It could be 1,000 things. And here's just an example. I've really oversimplified the model. And in design, again, we've broken them down to those activities and those deliverables, and in develop as well. But then if we go to the next slide, once we've deconstructed this and broken this down, what we have is a system. So it probably rings a bell, like when you have a design system and you can turn everything into components, we basically turned the process into our components. And by having these components, it allows us to work in creative ways. And it allows us not to be linear, which most processes are, and be non-linear, which is basically, we can work it depending on what the problem is. So if we go to the next slide, please, I'll give an example. So basically, if you think about it, if we go to the lowest common denominator, all projects, or all initiatives, they're always pretty much, there's a big time and budget kind of governance going in there. And depending on that, it's going to depend on what and how we play that process. And again, this is what works for us. So we take these components. So if we go to the next slide and imagine we have a shorter, a kind of shorter timeline, we can't do the full gamut of the process we had before. So it allows us to be, pick and choose and see what really does work in there. And if we go to the next slide, please, I'm just showing one more example again. And as you can see, we're not playing in sequence. There could be discovery, design and develop, but sometimes we might develop and then discover, or sometimes we might design and then discover and then develop. Everything works. There is no wrong way or right way. Of course, some moves are riskier, but it's all about bringing creativity back. It's all about going back to the basics of going out there, not being religious to a process and crunching through a problem. If we go to the next slide, please. And we call this designing in rather than designing out. The design team at Visa is fantastic. They do stellar work for our clients and our partners. But all of a sudden we're thinking, why don't we use that to design inwards? Why don't we use that to, just like the example I showed you just now, to create this system? What if we apply those principles to the way we work? No longer are we rinse and repeating and just going through the BAU. We're looking at things differently every time we encounter a project or an initiative. And it's, for us, it's the best way to go about those outcomes. Every project is different. Every initiative is different. They work in different ways. So let's treat them that way and give them that special kind of treatment. If we go to the next slide, please. But also one thing that we're very keen on pushing, and this is something I do share and I ask everyone to do, is appreciate what's out there. Appreciate, when you see another process, appreciate and appropriate it, but don't just imitate it. Understand it, because then you can take the pieces you want. We've done this a number of times. We've seen something out there. Oh, this is really interesting what the CX partners are doing. Why don't we try that ourselves? Does it work? It does. It does not. Okay, maybe it doesn't work for us, or maybe it does. And we're very appreciative of that. So we're not scared of looking at something, really thinking about why is it used, how is it done, and if we can then put that into our model, into our system, and if it enriches, it will stick there. So again, appreciate and appropriate. It's a fundamental capability we have as designers, but don't imitate those patterns of success. Just understand them. Next slide, please. And with that, I think it's about finding your own process. I said at the beginning, what I've just been speaking about just now, this is how we do things at Visa. It works for us. If it works for someone else, fantastic. And if it doesn't, find your own process. Remember, don't follow the masses. One more before I go to people, one more slide. Next slide, please. Outcomes over process. I guess, here I'm just reiterating the fact and the point that Stuart made in his presentation. Never forget this. It's all about the outcome. Sometimes we're so bogged down with process, we actually forget to do the design. So I've talked about process, but what about people? Next slide, please. And if we can go to the next one. As you all know, design is about intimate collaboration. I've just read this fantastic book, which has just come out by Mauro Borsini. He's the CMO at Pepsi. And he talks about we're people that fall in love with people. And we're all about sharing that love and making their lives better. And it's true, design is about intimate collaboration. It's about talking to people. And it's also talking to people that are not exactly under the design moniker, which is something we've been striving to do here at Visa. Next slide, please. So one thing we've done, and again, I'm reissuing a point from Stuart's presentation, we've decentralized the centralized. We had a centralized design function and we pushed it out. We have a slew of new product developments and existing product developments, and we've taken our designers out to them so they can work as bespoke individual teams, and they can work around, and we can take our model of how we go about those. We can break down problems into smaller pieces, and then we can use our component kind of framework to go about and fix those. But we've also centralized the decentralized. And when I say that, those projects and initiatives, they now come through a project house at Visa. So we have full viewership of what's actually happening. I think it's not going to be too distant if I say there's a lot of companies out there that duplicate, triplicate projects, or there's initiatives that look similar that should be done together. That way, by decentralizing our talent, but centralizing the workflow and ensuring that all projects come through one centralized fashion, we know that we're just doing things the right way. We're doing things once, not 3 times. And, this is a model, again, that's been working for us. And if we go to the next slide, please, I always make reference to, the 7 Samurais by Kurosawa. It's a small team. It's a functional team. They all have their bespoke, expertise. They come from different parts of the organization, and putting those in and forming that cocktail is what comes out with that result. Next slide, please. But also, we also look at how to scale those mini orgs and the composition of those groups. So again, we're not stuck, just like we're not stuck into a dogmatic process where we follow a ton of steps. We also look at these groups. It's not, there should be one designer, there should be 2 engineers, there should be 1 product. Some teams have 1 designer, 6 engineers, and someone from product. Some have 50-50 design engineering, some have 3 from product. We're fine with that. It's organic. Every product is at a different stage. Every product's got a different need. And also these teams fluctuate. So they kind of grow with the ebb and the flow of the initiative as we go through. So we always try and have a minimum of a 1 player of design in there, but that can fluctuate as we go through. So it just grows organically with the product and with the service itself. So it's something that goes through organically and systematically. Next slide, please. But then last but not least, we're more than willing to go rogue. And when I say go rogue, it's, sometimes we've got to break this model. Just like we broke our process, we broke it down into components, and we've got these teams now, and we've decentralized the designers. We don't mind going rogue all of a sudden on initiative. If we think we should try something new, if we think something's not working, we don't, just when you're skiing or you're snowboarding and you go off piste, at the end of the day, you want to get down to the mountain, you want to get back down to the chairlift. It's just how you go about it. So not all are the same, when you have to respect that, just like all projects aren't the same. So going rogue is something we're trying to push back. We feel that design has become too corporate, and sometimes we fall in that, de-risking too much or playing a little bit too safe. And we have to remember that some of the best designs out there, some of the best designs that surround us were, there were accidents that just occurred, and all of a sudden magic happened. And we're trying to bring that back to our practice. So we're trying to invoke the go rogue. It doesn't mean we go rogue every day at every hour of the day, but we're not afraid to do so. And with that, I think Stu just jumped to the last slide. I want to say thank you very much, or gracias, as we say in Spain, and thanks for listening. I think we've got questions.
Great. Thank you so much, both. That was really, really interesting. Yes, please do pop your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can now. So I've got a couple for you to start things off. If you are not a decision maker, how do you convince those that are that decentralizing control is the right thing to do?
Shall I?
No, you first. Yeah, fire away.
I mean, I think from my point of view, I think often someone needs to make a case that this is the right thing to do. And I guess there's a few ways to make the case to more senior leaders. Sometimes that's evidence from customer research. Videos are really compelling in doing that. It might be using some data about why the products or services aren't working, and why there needs to be a change of in the way of doing things. Or sometimes we run this survey, this customer centricity survey, where you get a score and that after doing it. And so having something like that, a tool or something you can point to go, we need to do things differently. And I guess, it's just making a really compelling case that maybe gets leaders to kind of think differently about how things need to work. But Andrés, I don't know whether you've got a different view.
No, I think, one thing we tend to do is when we try and break something new, we try and do it with smaller projects. There's the big initiatives, there's the big chunky initiatives, which are difficult to move, and there's a lot of stakeholders involved. But I always say it's the little projects and the sum of those little initiatives that actually start changing the way we work. So we can go about and tackle something in an original, distinct way. And then when the results come in and all of a sudden that little project blossoms into something, because we did it this way and we tried this model. So sometimes it's about showing them how it works. It's not just telling them. And that's worked for us, and I'm all for, doing these small projects, these small initiatives, because then when you put them together, you get that momentum, and then you've earned the trust of everyone to say, okay, now we're going to apply this on one of the large chunky ones. And for us, that's worked quite well. So I always think, think small to be big.
I think that trust thing is a really important point, that establishing the trust, and you do need those smaller things. It's hard to just go in straight away with the big bold vision and change things. It's to establish that trust, it is often the smaller projects that have that can help the start of that journey.
Great, thank you both. Becky asked, where can I learn more about identifying good outcomes? Do either of you have any suggestions for her?
I think there's quite a few books out there on OKRs. I can't remember the name of the author, that Christina Watka's has written one, and there's another one, and then there's, I refer to it in my talk, there's this book called Outcomes Over Outputs, which is a really nice short book. I think you can read it in like 45 minutes. But that's maybe that's a useful starting point.
I was going to say the same thing. It's just that's a good question and a difficult one. There's so many ways about that. Reading more about that is definitely the way to approach it. And there was that one, it was CFUN, the book you mentioned in your presentation, Stuart. I can't remember. I think that one,
Outcomes Over Outputs. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And if anyone else has any more suggestions, please pop them in the chat as well, and we can all see any further recommendations. With such an organic approach to delivery, how do you plan and forecast OpEx and headcount?
Yeah, I think if when we look at our projects, the way we go about it, and by having deconstructed it in such a way, one thing I probably forgot to mention as well, in each of these modules or these components we create, we also assign what's the headcount to actually do that, and what's the lift to actually do that. So there's metrics associated to each thing. So if I were to break down, for example, let's be really basic and say, in the discovery, we would have qual research, and I would break that down to 4 to 6 weeks. And there's 2 researchers that go on that, and there's 2 researchers at 100%. You can then do the math. So the good thing about this component way is when we then plot out, because all the Lego pieces, if we want to call them, already have associated, what that percentile is, how many resources there are, we can then map that. Once you get a bunch of streams, then you can cross-reference the streams, and then you can kind of predict where we're going to run into some issues. We're going to run into, okay, at this moment in time, we're going to have a bunch of researchers doing this. We're going to have there's going to be a crack. So one of the reasons we broke that down, and we broke it down in such a way, was to get a distinct understanding of what each component was. So it's not just the activity, the deliverable, but it's the resources associated, and it's the assignation to that. And for us, that's been, that's the way we do it. And then we have a mid-year and then a full year, and then we can kind of plot and see where we are, and hopefully get some more headcount. I do want to say, though, headcount at Visa is a difficult one to get. So we've got to make a magical case. But yeah, that's definitely helped us so far.
Great. So Mark comments that he's an advocate and he loves the pragmatic, not dogmatic theme, and the emphasis on reality, not religion, with the process. Do you feel that GDS have something to learn from your experience? Stu?
I mean, it's probably one for Andrés as well, but it was interesting because I at Six Partners, I work in the financial services team, but there's a public services team as well who obviously have to follow that framework, and they go through all the assessments. And we were kind of talking about it before this talk, and kind of musing on the idea that, it's great and it does establish a kind of process, but again, it can become dogmatic, and that, there are ways it could improve and be more flexible. It's kind of beyond my knowledge to kind of pinpoint exactly how it needs to change, but I think there's definitely a kind of view that it could evolve and be less rigorous, not rigorous, less kind of dogmatic.
I think if you look at it, I think it's just like design in general. I always say to some of the designers, don't get emotionally attached to your work, because it's going to go through lots of trials and tribulations until it gets to the end result. I say exactly the same thing about process. The best process is the one that works, and the one that works today. Maybe in 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, it's going to be completely different, as long as you accept that. And it's also, we're not inventing the wheel. It's not something that we've created. Our process is an amalgamation of stuff and experiences that we've seen out there. So there's no proprietary kind of, oh, this is mine and we've got to do it this way. No, we're fine on knowing and not getting emotionally attached, and knowing when to try something new. And we see stuff every other week, and hey, why don't we try this? Why not? That's how we're going to be better. That's how we don't get complacent and we're going to do better work all the time. Otherwise, you just get in automatic mode, and we don't want that. I know.
So we've had a question. You talk about the freedom to make decisions, but how much is also important about the freedom to onboard the right tools?
Good question. Especially in looking, we're actually going through this exercise right now in more on the discovery, and there's a slew of amazing research tools out there. And again, and I brought this before, because before I was full agency, and one thing I used to do in the agency was every project we'd use back in the day. Now it's all Sketch and Figma, but there was Affinity, there was Fireworks, there was Photoshop. So we'd say every project we'd do with a different tool, just to keep us alive and keep us fresh on what's out there. Because otherwise, it's like process, you become too religious for the tool. So the same thing as we're doing that now. We're trying to, okay, we're going to do this project with this research tool. Okay, we're going to do this one remote. We're going to use this tool. And it's just try them. And sometimes you get good surprises, and sometimes, but you're never going to know unless you try it. People can talk to you about them, but unless you try them yourself. And luckily in our design org at a global level, we're very open to tooling and how we can flip that, how we can change that, how we can find better ones. So I think we're extremely lucky, but again, just like everything, we're not afraid to try something. And we have failed when we tried with certain tools, and you're in the fray of a project and all of a sudden it's like, why the hell did I choose this tool? But that's what designers do. You learn from your mistakes, and the next time you don't trip up over the same stone.
Great. Anything to add?
It's interesting. It sounds like you've got quite a lot of flexibility at Visa. You've worked with organizations where it's much more locked down, and there's long kind of approval processes to get tools, Figma in particular, because it's cloud-based, causes a lot of problems for organizations. And but it's amazing it's almost disproportionate what an impact it has, especially when you're working remotely. Not having the right tools can it can have a huge impact. But
I think COVID there played a very big part in all of a sudden relinquishing control to, because for Visa, our machines, just like any organization, are very much governed. But all of a sudden we were given free rein with certain things during COVID. And it's just, we've learned from that. It's something that's made us better. And I think that was super important. All of a sudden we had free rein, free license to try new stuff. And all of a sudden that blossomed into just a bucket load of creativity. Oh, we can do this and we can do that. Oh, wow, we didn't know this. And I think that's one of the things that we've learned and we've kept since then. So yeah, COVID had a lot of negatives, but for that, it was a positive for us.
So another question for you, Andrés, is can you be more specific on how your product house in Visa works? Does it own the whole process or only some milestones?
I think it depends on the initiative. If we're looking at new product development, the innovation and design team, we take on a number of activities or a number of initiatives, better said, a year, and we're focused on those specific ones. So we take the lead on those, and we take the lead from the exploration all the way up to MVP, or is there a product market fit? Does this experience resonate with customers, and will this work? And then there are more, then once we get to what we call existing product, that's more governed by the product team. So again, there's more of a product led. It's maturing a product. It's getting that product out there. And again, that's where we kind of draw back, because design here and innovation work, let's say, at the tip of the spear. And now we're also helping put out those product experiences. Also, like I mentioned at the beginning, we've got the agency side to help the business win more business. So we're using design now. Also, how do we communicate this? How do we educate our clients and partners about what these do? So it really depends on the phase of where that product is. But if it's new product development, it's very much governed by innovation and design, and then it just goes over to the other side. But we're there all the time. It just depends, like I said, the fluctuation of, what's our presence in that.
Great.
I hope that's the question.
Thank you. Ollie says, I love the idea of going rogue to inspire creativity, but how do you choose when's the right time to go rogue?
Good question. Sometimes it's, I think part of going rogue as well is you follow your heart and your gut. I think sometimes we're overthinking things, and sometimes we go for, the mindful, but sometimes you get that inkling. Sometimes you think, why don't we try something different here? You just get that feeling, whether that's experience, whether that's looking for trouble. We don't know what it is. But it's up until now, it's why don't we try something? We're doing this new proposition for the Olympics, which I can't mention a lot about, but the way we went about that project was drastically different to the way we went on others. All of a sudden, we put something out there and we just did a rogue concept, and it kind of held. And then we got down to doing what I call the serious design work. But that was just the moment came, why don't we do this? Let's do it. And we just rolled. So sometimes it's less the mind, less overthinking, and just let's get stuff done. Let's just put something out there. And if, my father always said to me, he goes, it's better to make a bad decision fast than making no decision at all. And he's right, because if you make a decision and it's bad, but you've done it quickly, you can correct sooner, than you think. Sometimes we think too much, and all of a sudden we get into the non-decision kind of mood, and we're there for months. So yeah, it's more quantum. I don't have a specific answer for that. And it's me and my team. Why don't we try this? Let's try it. I think we need a different approach. Let's try it. And while we do that, I think we will be where we will be. And the day we don't do that, we need to find something else to do.
Great. So I think we'll probably do our last question now, but I think this is quite a tricky one. So people are asking about how long it might take to implement new ways of working, or Stu, your sort of decentralized controlled, the decentralized model. What are the timescales that people are looking at to try and implement some of these changes?
I mean, from the work we've done, I think about one particular client where I think I showed the example of where we did some pilot ways of working. We defined kind of how they should be working, and then that led on to further, more strategic work. I mean, it's probably years. It's doing the small projects to kind of, as we were saying, to establish trust can be done within a year, and then to get the permission to set visions and so on, and act in more of a strategic way. I think that's over a year, 2 years, and it kind of depends on the maturity of the organization as well. It depends where you're starting from. So yeah, it depends, I guess, is the answer.
Andrés, anything to add there?
No, I think Stuart ended right. It really does depend. I've been at Visa 3 years now, and it's a slow process. You corner some parts, you find some co-conspirators in certain parts of the organization, and all of a sudden the next week you find another part of the organization which are completely, green and embryonic, and they didn't know exactly what you're doing. So it's mixed and varied. So it does depend. There's the maturity is at a level, but then how that level is perceived in certain parts of the organization, it does vary. It's not unified, that's for sure. So I think, yeah, I'll stick with Stuart's, it depends.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry if we didn't quite get to your question. If you would like us to answer it outside of the webinar, please just email through to marketing@cxpartners.co.uk and we'll get that answered for you. Brilliant to hear from you both today, Stu and Andreas. Thank you so much. We've got our next session next Wednesday at 11 and we'll be covering employee experience in that one. Again, please let us know if you don't already have that in your diary, marketing@cxpartners.co.uk. But again, thank you, everybody. It was great to see you all.
Thank you very much.